Daft Punk were one of the most influential, iconic, and recognizable groups of our century so far, and now that they're done making music, this is how I rank all of their albums least favorite to favorite. This video is brought to you by Skillshare. If you want to enrich your creativity in 2021, you can celebrate the new year by learning new skills on Skillshare. For number 6, I picked Tron Legacy. Remember back in the 2000s when every single blockbuster movie came out alongside a terrible Game Boy Advance game? I had the Aragon game when I was like 6 years old, and it was just awful. They would go in, reskin some other game, dumb down the gameplay, and just overall make it worse. And I don't know if these games sold well, but I think they served a purpose. It's just like diversifying your market, getting your brand out there to make it more memorable to the consumer. Anyway, I don't know if there's even a good comparison here, but Daft Punk's Tron Legacy score kind of does remind me of a movie video game. You know, it's probably top 2 or 3 movie soundtracks of all time for me, but it's still a movie soundtrack, and Daft Punk had to adapt their sound to the needs of the movie's tone, which inherently means they had to dumb themselves down. There are some great songs on the Daft Punk Tron Legacy soundtrack, but it's just not as iconic as the rest of their music, even if it is an amazing movie score. In 5th place, I picked Homework, the album that started it all. This record changed electronic music. When it came out in 1997, Europe was booming with house music, and Daft Punk's Homework was wildly better than the formula that the genre was in at the time. It's like trap bursting into the hip-hop scene and destroying boring bling rap. Homework was so successful it charted internationally, bringing Daft Punk and the French house scene tons of exposure. Musically though, I have nothing against Homework, but I don't feel like there's anything on it that Daft Punk didn't do better later on. Sitting here in my room with headphones on, listening to 7 minutes of Around the World, it probably feels different than it would have felt in a French nightclub 20 years ago. So yeah, I can see how Homework was massively influential when it came out, but later on, I feel like most of Daft Punk's music following this project improved on the sound and formula by getting rid of the monotony and adding a much more dynamic feel to their arrangements and song structure that lets the music stand on its own as a listening experience and not just songs and tracks for clubbing. For number 4, I picked Human After All. To most people, Human After All is the weakest link out of Daft Punk's official studio projects, but in my mind, it's really not as bad as people say. I actually think there's some interesting stuff in this album, but I can understand how, ironically, most fans just didn't think it was human enough. The album is mixed like an ice cube, with cold, sawtooth synth chords and harsh, aggressive, almost robotic guitar riffs defining the majority of its biggest moments. In reality, though, there is a bit more nuance than that. The track Make Love is a 5-minute, down-tempo, nighttime robot ballad, and even though it's so simple and almost unnoticeable, practically background music, I think there's a profound warmth to it, at least compared to the rest of the record. Overall, though, there are a lot of Daft Punk fans that will quickly describe Human After All as artificial, cold, repetitive. People just don't think the band put in enough time with the record. It was produced entirely in just a 6-week period. But in my opinion, I think Human After All is a good record. It's not melodic, poppy disco funk, that's obvious, and that's probably why a lot of fans didn't enjoy it too much, especially after the 4-year wait between Discovery and Human After All. You know, the band only used 2 drum machines, 2 guitars, a vocoder, and an 8-track to make the entire record. All of that, plus the heavy guitars and drums, it gives Human After All an almost retro-futuristic feel. I can imagine the record playing in the background of A Clockwork Orange while the characters beat someone up or something. Either way, I do think there's a lot more to this album than meets the eye. I will admit it's not their warmest or most enjoyable project, but Thomas and Guy-Manuel did talk later on about how the album's aesthetic was in many ways supposed to convey negative feelings of technological paranoia. So overall, you know, I can understand how there are definitely things they could have done better. I still think Human After All is an interesting record full of textures and ideas that they hadn't explored before and wouldn't go back to later. It's Daft Punk at their most robotic, and in the end, I think they made it work. In 3rd place, I picked Alive 2007. Alive 2007 isn't really an album, so to speak, and it certainly doesn't contain new material, but even so, a lot of Daft Punk fans consider it one of their best releases, and I even know a few weirdos who would call it their favorite ever. I can't comment much on the music here because, well, it's a live record, but I can say Alive 2007 is maybe one of the best live records ever released. You know, it's got a good bit of background noise, overall slightly tinny mixing, but the energy is unmatched. Daft Punk are famous for their live shows, and now that they're broken up, this is as close as most fans will ever get to seeing them live. Putting this record on in the car and just driving is fun as hell, and even though there are no real new songs on Alive 2007, the way Daft Punk remixed basically everything to just go hard gives a bunch of iconic Daft Punk songs an entirely new sound. A lot of people praised Alive 2007 for greatly improving on several tracks from Human After All as well. In some ways, it almost feels like Alive 2007 is a greatest hits album for Daft Punk, taking their best songs, somehow making them more energetic and having a great time while doing it. You know, I'm kind of sad that I'll never go to a Daft Punk concert, but at least I can hear what they sounded like. And it really speaks to the group's dedication to their craft that a simple live album could be considered among their best work. It is incredibly well polished. I've been listening to Alive 2007 for years, and I just keep coming back to it. It's a good time. In second place, I picked Discovery. Discovery is what made Daft Punk legends, and I think despite being 20 years old, it's still an amazing album, completely timeless, original, and massively influential. Discovery took what made Homework popular in the world of French house music and turned that formula into a major international pop hit, without sacrificing the integrity of the sound. Discovery was a big success in the US and the UK as well as Canada, and of course in France. The record had a big impact on the music community as well, with Kanye's Stronger sampling Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, and bringing the group even more publicity later in the decade. Critics called the album progressive disco, saying it was cinematic, cohesive, and complex. Far less repetitive than Homework, the album had recognizable hooks, most of which remain iconic to this day, 20 years later. And in my opinion, compared to Homework, the sound of Discovery is still fresh to this day. It flows so well, with every song being memorable and moving. I think it's going to last for a very long time as one of the best electronic music albums ever made. In first place, I picked Ram. Random Access Memories is the classy album. This is probably one of my top 5 favorite albums of all time. There's no doubt when I say that. Ram is cohesive, cinematic, emotional, bittersweet. Looking back, it almost feels like a goodbye album in some parts. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but Ram really was a sentimental project. Humanity versus technology has always been a theme in Daft Punk's music, and Ram is the first time it feels like they really cracked the code. Songs like Touch, Within, Motherboard, these are heartwarming, beautiful, deeply personal tracks, and coming from a band that got their big break from making house music for clubs, this progression is just insanely impressive. And in my opinion, Ram is also one of the best mixed albums of all time, though there are other people who share that opinion as well. In the words of audio engineer Ian Shepherd, the reason why Ram sounds so good is because they engineered it with bass in mind, making sure all bass tones were warm, clean, and loud. They also put a lot of time into the high end as well. The high end on Ram is clear and open and never harsh. A lot of time and effort was put into making that work, and that isn't a typical strategy in today's climate. Typically, pop engineers place a heavy emphasis on overall loudness, which greatly reduces detail in bass and treble. But Ram's mix is much more careful, and in turn, the record sounds much more detailed, intentional, and fancy, as funny as that might sound. Beyond the impeccable mixing though, because I'm sure a lot of people don't really care about that, Ram completely shook up the music industry as a whole. I know that's a bold claim, but hear me out. When this record came out in 2013, Skrillex was the big kid on the block. Seriously, think back to 8 years ago. EDM was dominant in pop music. Every pop star was making songs with EDM drops, dubstep noises, abrasive synths, all of that. There was really no retro disco funk in mainstream music. But when Ram dropped, taking massive influence from disco funk sounds, everyone started doing it. It became passé eventually, but Ram remains fresh, the timeless blueprint. Songs like Happy, Uptown Funk, they all followed in Ram's footsteps, and yeah, they eventually faded away, but Ram remains a beautiful album to this day. And even though it was a huge success, releasing it was kind of a risk. Luckily though, it ended up paying off, and then some. Random Access Memories is by far one of my favorite records of all time. I could make an entire video about this album, and I probably will, but it's just so good. I think I heard it for the first time when it came out. I was 13 years old, and it introduced me to 2 musical concepts, silence and grooves. Up to that point, a lot of the music I had been exposed to was pop, rock, and folk, and it was good music, but, short songs, basic song structures. But there's so much to appreciate about Random Access Memories and the way Daft Punk was able to create a beautiful mix of disco, funk, jazz, sci-fi synths, completely genreless grooves on Motherboard and beyond. It's one of the most interesting and gripping albums I've ever heard. There's just so much going on and so much to listen to. I even think this album will get more popular as time goes on and end up being considered one of the best albums of its decade. I mean, Random Access Memories, in the 8 years since it came out, it's become one of my most listened to records of all time. You can dance to it, you can cry to it. I know I've done both. Now, I don't know what the group's intention was when making this record. No one does. But I know it's been a faithful companion to my life in a way that very few albums ever have. I feel like the best music in life is music we can rely on like an old friend. And I think everyone has a record like that. In this way, Random Access Memories has been there for me. As weird as that might sound, I owe Daft Punk for this one. This has been Volksgeist. Thank you for watching. Like I mentioned earlier, if you want to pursue something creative to start 2021 and learn how to better express your thoughts and feelings through media, I highly recommend checking out Skillshare. I use Skillshare all the time to brush up on my video editing and animation skills, and I honestly can't recommend it enough. Skillshare offers meaningful membership. There are many different avenues and techniques to explore for each subject, real projects to create, and a great community of people on there. In short, Skillshare empowers people to pursue real growth and truly better themselves with new skills. And look, to put it simply, Skillshare is a great website with actually useful classes on creative topics. Their lessons can help you stay inspired, express yourself, motivate you, and introduce you to a community of millions of users. And they have many interesting topics covered by industry professionals, from music production, audio engineering, motion graphics, graphic design, video editing and photography, to business and more. Skillshare has no ads, and they're always launching new classes. Some of my YouTube friends even have great classes on there, like Thomas Frank's amazing productivity course or Ali Abdal's studying and video editing tutorials. But seriously, there are classes for just about everything, from mixing your music to make it sound better, to producing crazy beats, to animating in After Effects, the same software I use. Skillshare has something for everyone. By the way, my personal favorite class at the moment is William Kessling's class on how to animate a logo in After Effects. It includes a lot of the same techniques I use for my videos and is extremely helpful if you want to start using the same software I use. Anyway, last but not least, a premium annual membership with Skillshare is super affordable at less than $10 a month. So if you want to join Skillshare and upgrade your skills, get your free trial at the link in the description below. That's skl.sh/Volksgeist02211. Clicking on the link really helps out my channel.